Welcome to Transform Now, the podcast brought to you by robotic process automation pioneer Blue Prism. Digital transformation has the potential to reshape the way companies service their customers, engage their employees, and manage their operations. Whether you're looking to develop strategies, tactics, and best practices to positively impact the future of work, or you're curious to learn how other companies have successfully navigated their digital transformation programs, then this podcast is for you. We're here to help you transform now.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brad Hairston with Blue Prism. Welcome to the Transform Now podcast. Today, I am thrilled to have as my guest my colleague, Gary Smith, who is the Vice President of Sales Strategy and Industries at Blue Prism in the Americas. Gary and I are going to focus this podcast on debunking one of the biggest, if not the biggest, myth about robotic process automation. Gary, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, hi Brad. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here and a big fan of the podcast.
Excellent. So why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, thank you. Brad, I've been at Blue Prism now approaching 6 years, so I'm one of the early folks. I think I was employee number 38 globally and the second salesperson in the Americas. So I came out of a deep background in technology, and Blue Prism, I was brought over with a former manager from FICO. And when I heard what the value proposition was, it was such a big mission that the company was on at that time and remains on.
So, Gary, it is great to have you be a part of this. Since you have been in the RPA space for several years now, we call that an RPA veteran, Gary. That's what you are. So,
I think in my case, I might be an RPA fossil.
You've definitely seen intelligent automation evolve quite a bit during your tenure. And along the way, I should mention, you've successfully sold to and guided many of our largest financial services accounts. Thus, your perspective really comes with a lot of firepower. So, Gary, without further ado, what exactly is the biggest myth about RPA? Can you begin there?
Yeah, absolutely, Brad. And I think it's a really important starting point because to my mind, the biggest myth about RPA is that it's all about automation. And what I mean when I say that is I think we get trapped in an old paradigm of software, eating the world as they say at Andreessen Horowitz, or software solving all of our ills. And this is actually not a software problem. It is a true labor issue, right? And if you think about it, we get evaluated based mainly on being a technology when really we're simply underpinned by technology. But what we are is a labor source that is capable of being scaled fully, just like humans would be. It's capable of having skills added to it, just like you would upskill a human laborer, right? It's just that Blue Prism digital workers, for them, the skills are adding something maybe like computer vision so they can read a document, natural language processing and generation, all those elements. And so I think what we've gotten into is a situation where people think of RPA and it equals technology. And really what RPA equals is, to my mind, is labor. And I have seen the very best in-class organizations across the world adopt it from the latter perspective, not from the former of it being a technology.
Interesting. So what's been the fallout from this misperception that you just described?
Yeah, let me maybe give you an example that I think is pertinent here, and it kind of shapes my thinking. Last April of 2020, I should say, not this past April, there was a really interesting McKinsey article that came out, the digital-led recovery from COVID-19, 5 questions for CEOs. One of the things that it identified is that many leaders have been frustrated, corporate leaders have been frustrated by how slowly the necessary changes have moved for their organizations to adapt in times of an operating crisis. If you think about it, in fact, most immediately transitioned to our disaster scenario operating mode. And that really, as we've seen, that's proved inadequate. In fact, McKinsey concluded that they believe that one of the biggest reasons for the difficulties that these organizations are facing is that organizations have had many digital pilots and initiatives in place. What they didn't have didn't add up to a coherent and integrated digital engine or digital labor source to actually drive the business forward. In that same month, April of 2020, and it seems to me it was coincidental, but I think everybody was maybe just on the same wavelength because of COVID, the MIT Sloan Management Review had an article, and in it, they noted most organizations rely on very, very traditional governance approaches that prioritize compliance and risk mitigation for the business. This really, what they concluded was that executives need to rethink that governance approach for a model of digital transformation in a way that it will actually prioritize active enablement over control, right? So in other words, it would be how you would run a regular business of humans, right? You just need to apply that to the digital workers, but you need to do it in a way that now recognizes there is this merged workforce of humans and digital workers. Now, 16 months before that, and I know, Brad, I probably sound like a broken record right now, there was, in fact, by no coincidence other than the fact that digital automation was purely center stage, as it's one of the hottest capabilities for organizations to be considering, both McKinsey in their article, Synergy and Disruption, the 10 Trends Shaping FinTech, as well as Forrester in their paper, The Future of Organizations, wrote about the challenges for organizations, particularly in their cases, those two articles, banks. And what was their conclusion other than they need to change the operational model because the old model has aged out and they have to incorporate the value of digital innovation, including digitally sourced labor and the AI that really expands the capability of that labor to do things in a more human-esque fashion. So really, Brad, you asked the question about the fallout from the misperception. The challenges of having the introduction of a digital labor source without an aligned operating model to accommodate that in human labor, those challenges, I should say, never went away. And the complications have made organizations go through really unnatural acts, in part because the C-suite has not accepted their responsibility that they have to be the change agent sponsors to drive this model pivot. And that's really what it is, right? This can't be abdicated to a mid-level leadership team or a mid-level manager or even a managing director or a senior vice president. And it certainly can't be led at levels below that and isn't something that IT can lead from a technology perspective. Because again, this is going in a very, very different direction. You're talking about the labor that produces the work product value of the organization. And that level simply wouldn't have the authority or the mandate to make sweeping policy and staffing changes like the C-suite would.
A couple of the things I hear you saying here: one, digital transformation has been way too slow, and two, the C-level has not been in the driver's seat as much as they should. Is that fair?
Yeah, Brad, that's really well put. In fact, there's an old proverb in the United States military that the experienced talk about logistics and the uninitiated think in terms of strategy. I really agree with this view, and I think it's highly applicable to this discussion because we often think strategy rules, but in the end, if you don't have the proper plan to implement and carry out the strategy, what good is the best strategy, right? It's for the military, it's akin to saying, I've got this great battle plan, this great battle strategy, but if I can't get my troops and equipment there, or I get them there, but I can't get their resupply there, what good is it doing, right? And so if you think about it in that manner, the further complication of it becomes that we don't quite express that logistical vision of what the transformation should look like and what results a client should expect. And this is evidenced by customers and prospects constantly asking us, Brad, for use cases. And what they're really seeking to understand is how have others reliably monetized the investment and created a repeatable engine, right? Which is really to say, how did they get their program to scale? Because they want to realize that not only the economic gain, but from a competitive point of view, in some cases, it's an existential imperative as their industry is under fire from new competitors that they never thought would exist, right? And Again, the problem gets exacerbated because use cases are really an old IT expression used to measure specific benefits of application consumption, right? In creating a business case, if you will. We're bringing in a digital labor pool to act as workers, fully capable of carrying out almost any number of tasks, right? I think we'd all agree, with the exception of things like creativity and inventing things, interaction with other humans. It's just not there. And in our lifetime likely won't be. But it's all those things that are doing the things of accessing systems and data in an organization that they're working in a way that we need to speak to it in that very specific manner. Most of the very best in class that I've seen across my experience here has been that RPA's got to be regarded as labor, pure and simple. And its delivery of value comes through the work product that it's actually bringing to the organization.
Gary, as we change our thinking around intelligent automation and we think of it as an alternative labor source, I think it's important to differentiate digital labor from human labor. Let me ask you this. What are the shortcomings of human labor that digital labor can mitigate?
Yeah, and Brad, you're getting right to the heart of the matter, right? Because this, to me, this is where the conversation has to start. After you talk about how you're going to operationalize and monetize it with an operating model, right, then you get to this point. It's not use case driven. I'll give several examples. Sensitive work and data access that can be corrupted for personal gain, right? We've seen it time and again, whether it's rogue traders, whatever it is, there are sensitivities and there are highly corruptible work processes that humans do that we've read about in the news, right? And people have either absconded with tens of millions of dollars, or you read about all sorts of horror stories. The other thing that is insidious, but it's less intentional, is mistake-prone work that can result in really expensive problems, either to fix them or in their cost to the customer experience, our customer's customer experience, known as Net Promoter Score, right? And then there's things like non-compliance in the highly regulated industries, like whether it's in the financial services sector or the pharmaceutical manufacturing sector, whatever those areas are where non-compliance can produce millions, if not tens of millions of dollars in fines for what really was just an innocent human mistake. There's also the ability to instantly produce an auditable record with a digital labor source that humans will never be able to carry out. Digital laborers, literally every single thing that they've done through a process and every outcome of that process is all within Blue Prism. It's all part of the record. And that is auditable non-repudiation to defend in front of either a regulator that comes in for an annual audit or a quarterly audit. It certainly can be used to justify what was going on in the work process. And I'd say maybe the last thing that comes to mind, Brad, is the low value, high effort work that doesn't do anything really to improve either, again, the customer experience for our customer's customer, that Net Promoter Score or customer loyalty, and the disproportional cost to deliver something that at this point could be automated and put into a workflow that a digital laborer carries out.
Gary, what in your opinion is keeping most companies from viewing the digital workforce as an alternative labor source?
I think our time in the beginning, early round discussions with any prospect, and even some clients that have very new programs, it really comes back to talking about the software. And does the software integrate to the environment or support a specific InfoSec standard? Not the logistical enablement of a strategic digital workforce. And we've missed what that means to establish and expand the impact of that labor source, right? And it actually changes the tenor of the entire discussion all the way up to the board. Because what you're really saying is, this is not software. This is the logistical enablement, right, of a workforce. And you're integrating those workforces. In fact, we haven't even described to companies what the definition is for such a new additional labor source. And even worse, we go back and as we discussed, we've attached old irrelevant software product-based IT terms to think about something as monumentally transformative as a new source of less expensive and in some cases, in some areas, more reliable labor. When I say more reliable, there's very few things that are as reliable as a human, but the reliability of transposing numbers accurately every single time across millions and millions of rows of numbers. Humans get bored and distracted, right? Anything can take them off that task. That's not true of a digital worker. When I think of it, Brad, think about going after use cases and how exhausting that is to find automations that are based on removing very, very specific minutia tasks from human workers from an overall end-to-end process that they do in a given day. We didn't take that approach when we offshored labor initially to India to arbitrage that labor market in the 1990s, right? I think that's the model that we should be looking to largely as a representative blueprint to copy. We have to incorporate all of these elements that form the operational considerations to drive the KPIs for evaluation, not just simply a technology bake-off. Without making C-suites aware of the concepts of logistically deploying this new labor source to change the division of labor between humans and digital workers, RPA really gets reduced to just being another piece of software. It's another tool, another technology in the toolkit. Business operations think in terms of process, right? After all, they own them, they created them. IT thinks in terms of system and application tools that provide the efficiency for that human labor pool and the customers and the data. That's at the nexus of the struggle for RPA technology. And no one really speaks to the repeatable method to roll this out successfully in a manner that's reusable for continued value delivery against the investment. That RPA a lot of times gets relegated to a lower level IT or operations leader that can only make very limited decisions for their area on small budgets. And it hides that light under a bushel and doesn't get the broadcast of the C-suite.
And when that happens, Gary, I assume that diminishes the scaling of RPA and it reaching its full potential across the enterprise as well. Is that true?
Yeah, right on, Brad. That's exactly right. It's the RPA industry has been mistakenly selling the notion of a transformational digital labor source while hoping RPA end users would figure out the actual meaning of how value and the resulting benefits would be produced. Companies need a much better understanding of how a program at scale is created and executed.
Gary, what did the pandemic do in terms of changing perceptions about RPA?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brad. COVID-19 did something that no marketing campaign could ever produce. The reasons that it's a matter of existential concern to implement a digital labor source. For nearly all of Blue Prism's clients, our digital laborers' ability to work independently and quickly made the difference in being able to rapidly redistribute work from human FTEs that were no longer able to complete their jobs, and certainly not as teams because they weren't in the same conference room, they weren't able to meet up, and a lot of their work completion steps really depended on that. In fact, for banking, the way that we saw this manifest itself was in things like the Payroll Protection Program, the PPP that the United States government rolled out. Mm-hmm. That distribution, and as well as enacting a moratorium on loan repayments for a period of time, while reconfiguring how that repayment was being calculated and the principal and the interest were being suspended, we actually were told by our clients they had emergency meetings. And these were meetings that went into the wee hours of the mornings the first several days into the pandemic. And people were literally working around the clock, loading in the rules and the configuration to a Blue Prism digital labor. And they said, you guys saved the day. We had one banking customer. This was a client not in the United States, but they had utilized us to redistribute some of the government emergency funding for the small businesses in their country. We redistributed some $80 million worth of loans like within a 1 week span. They said that would have been nearly impossible to do with a human. They would have needed their teams working together in the same room to accomplish that.
That's great.
And I think, Brad, that the new impact, coupled with the fact, this new impact, rather, I should say, really, of COVID-19 as just one of what could potentially be future crises, right? With the fact that the C-suite and boards are still looking to free up human work capacity to create innovation, right? How do you get to innovation? You put more human minds on it, and support an increasing customer population with very high expectations for world-class experience. And I would argue that it's not just one uniform population looking for the same world-class experience. You've got 4 generations. You've got the boomers, you've got Gen X, you've got millennials, and you've got Gen Z. And they all expect very different things, so their definitions of world-class experience are different. That creating a new realization to do that is simply, you've got all sorts of competitive threats now of organizations trying to get to that. If you think about fintech or insurtech or whatever tech, that displacement is occurring because those organizations aren't burdened by maybe a more cemented in place type of a model approach that really was intended for one generation, but now has to be made in a different way, accessible to the other generations, right? And we're living in a world now where we're more frequently facing down pandemic crises. I mean, if you think about it, Brad, we've had H1N1, we've had bird flu, we've had all these things. Really, it feels like since '04, they've just increasing frequency. And it just happened that COVID this time got out of the containment and became the pandemic. But there's environmental shocks that I think we don't account for. Look at the storms in Texas in this past winter, Brexit, all these things. The ability for a business to nimbly be able to adapt their model to socio-political and environmental changes is really paramount. And this is the moment when the most aware and intellectual of executive leaders have to understand they need continuity in a way they've never considered it before. And we've got to exploit this to the highest degree possible, because we stand in a very unique position to provide the answer to that question that just most organizations aren't able to deliver, right? And more importantly, the executive suite is now ready and desperate for this type of an adult conversation, right? I think if I summed it up, Brad, we are the mechanism to protect organizations from these existential crises.
So, Gary, what's the path forward? How do we fully debunk the myth that RPA is all about automation and get everyone's head straight on what it truly is?
Yeah, Brad, I think we have to go back to the beginning and almost restart or reboot the conversation and re-educate the market on how we define and communicate the transformational narrative of the comprehensive value that Blue Prism's very unique type of digital labor, incorporating its ROM, its robotic operating model, which is a very boring way of saying how you operationalize and monetize this and integrate it with a human labor source. What is it providing to the enterprises? And then we need to focus away from things like product bake-offs, making it all about software, marketing speak and marketing hype. It's like Gartner calls the hype cycle. That's exactly what a lot of this has been. The feature function showdowns aren't going to save any company, right? We've got to pivot the thinking to providing a vision of redistribution of labor according to the core characteristics of speed, audit, compliance, mistake-prone and corruptible propensities in crisis scenarios, and do it by our customers' functional lines of business. We need to demonstrate to them how a program at scale is created and executed. Further, it needs to be a vision of, in redistributing that labor according to core characteristics, it needs to be executed at a functional level, right? And I know I'm kind of repeating myself, but I think what that means is it really is about getting a top-down approach in place, right? Where the C-suite and the board are mandating it, but then you're bringing in each of the lines of business with, and it has to be with, I can never stress this enough, with IT as a collaborator. They are essential to the success of this, right? But we need to guide them in a way that they're in the position to take the reins and turn their companies into innovative engines of prosperity.
So, Gary, you've worked with a lot of our customers, and I know there are some out there that truly do view intelligent automation as an alternative labor source. Can you share just a couple of examples just from your experience that would kind of drive this whole thing home? I think that would be really good.
Yeah, absolutely, Brad. I've had the great good fortune to work with a number of world-class banks in the time I've been here. And these organizations, they got it. It was the case where in the first meetings with them, they were finishing my sentences, I was finishing their sentences, and they've effectively looked at what Blue Prism is exactly like I've described. And in many ways, they've actually helped either reinforce my thinking on it, or they've actually shaped it by adding a dimension that I'd never even considered. And what they've done is they've truly used Blue Prism Digital Labor as a source of end-to-end workflow labor capability. And they've integrated it into their organization utilizing our robotic operating model. And they have given me feedback over the years that it's their hand in glove. You cannot do one without the other. You cannot deploy the technology without the operating model. It just won't work. And these are organizations, a couple of these banks, these are global 50 banks, by the way. So they are the largest of the most highly regulated institutions on the planet. And they are many, many hundreds, in some cases approaching 1,000 digital workers. I've also seen organizations, there's 2 energy companies in the UK they're effectively startup energy companies. They are absolutely levering Blue Prism Digital Labor as a differentiated way to run their business. So instead of hiring humans for a number of the things that are, again, low value add, but typically very costly if they have to put humans in chairs, they're using Blue Prism Digital Laborers to accomplish those work tasks. And they will actually express as a percentage of the organization that their percentage of labor is some percentage human and some percentage Blue Prism digital workers. And that probably the single best example that I know we can share from a name perspective is a company in Denmark, a financial services firm, Danica Pensions. Danica Pensions has actually gone on record to share with us that they have fully 20% of their labor source is Blue Prism digital workers. Right? They are merging the labor force exactly like we would say that you should. And it's just a remarkable thing to see. And the benefits that they talk of are in the tens or more millions of dollars annually returned to the business. So if you think about, if you spin it forward and you think about what they paid, the pittance that they paid to Blue Prism for that digital worker, they're getting returns in some cases of 3, 4, 5, 600% ROI. And this isn't something that they're waiting on forever. We're getting feedback from these clients that this is return they're getting within a year or 2 years. It's that rapid of a payback.
Well, Gary, thank you for sharing those examples. That's a really good way to wrap up today. And let me just thank you for being on with us and sharing your perspective. You've given everyone at Blue Prism and across our ecosystem, customers, prospects, partners, a lot to think about. We were so overdue in having you on the podcast, so I'm glad we righted that wrong today. And I got to say, you definitely did not disappoint. So thank you again. All the best, my friend.
Thank you, Brad. I greatly appreciate it. And it was my pleasure to be here. I'm really happy that you invited me, that this was just an area of passion for me, as you know.
Thanks for tuning in to Transform Now. For more insightful discussions on digital transformation and more, check out our podcast channel where you'll find all of our previous episodes. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player. And if you like what you heard, please leave us a review. For more information about digital transformation and the future of work, check out blueprism.com to learn how Blue Prism's digital workforce is enabling enterprise transformation now.